Hello, everybody. I hope you all are doing well. Let's continue our series of God and free will and this sub-series on Christianity and free will. I hope you all saw my last video on the theological determinism argument. If you haven't, you can watch it by clicking on the I button you see at the top right corner right now. So, according to the theological determinism argument, it's the end of the story for free will, right? Not so fast, says some theologians in their attempts to salvage free will. Let's first go through the so-called problem of evil, presented first by Greek philosopher Epicurus and then popularized by the famous David Hume and J.L. Mackie. It goes like this. Premise 1. If God exists, then God is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent by definition. Premise 2. If God is omniscient, God would know about any evil and he would know how to prevent all evil. Premise 3. If God is omnipotent, then God could prevent any and all evil. Premise 4. If God is omnibenevolent, then God would choose to prevent all evil. Premise 5. Evil exists. Premise 6. God does not prevent all evil. This means we have a contradiction. Therefore, the conclusion is that God does not exist. To save God from this contradiction, in comes Alvin Plantinga, who proposes his free will defense. He says, God being omnibenevolent and omnipotent at the same time does not mean that he can prevent all evil. And God gives freedom to human beings in the form of free will, and moral evils are the consequences of human beings and their free will, not God. So Plantinga says that God chooses the best possible world among infinite possible worlds, and he weakly actualizes that world, and this world that we're living in right now is the world that he chose and actualized. So according to Plantinga, to strongly actualize means to directly cause something, and to weakly actualize means to bring something into existence but not be the sole cause of it, everything that happens in that world. Already sounds fishy, right? So Plantinga says that a world with human freedom and human free will is immensely valuable, even if it means that we have to allow evil to exist in that world. So let's get to some of the objections that I have against Plantinga's free will defense. The first objection to Plantinga's free will defense is that if God is omnipotent, then why couldn't God have created a world in which there are free creatures who could choose both evil and good, but always freely choose good? If God has made men such that in their free actions they could freely choose evil or freely choose good, why couldn't he have weakly actualized a world in which men always freely choose good actions? There's no logical impossibility in that, and funny enough, Plantinga agrees with that. Plantinga then asserts that it is possible that all possible worlds will have at least one person who has something called Transworld Depravity. So it is possible that there is at least one person in every possible world who commits at least one wrong action in his life. Firstly, Transworld Depravity is baseless and unfalsifiable in the first place. And an easy objection to that is that we can imagine at least one free-willed person in at least one possible world who, before his death, commits at least one good action, or only commits good action, depending on when that person achieves the property of free will. If we can imagine at least one such a person, then Transworld Depravity makes no sense. And we actually can imagine such a person, which means that Transworld Depravity is not a necessary condition. This just means that still God can actually weakly actualize a world in which free-willed beings only commit good actions. But that's clearly not the kind of world that we're living in. Therefore, either God is not omnibenevolent or free will does not exist. Plantinga would agree that God has free will especially as he chooses between different possible worlds. And he would also agree that God only commits right actions. But if that's the case, then why is it that God is free and can only commit right actions? But when it comes to human beings, they cannot perform right actions without producing wrong actions. He could easily give his own characteristic to the people in the world that he actualizes, but it turns out it doesn't. Now, Plantinga would say that why would God give his kind of free will to the people in this world? Alright, but then you'll have to admit that God is not omnibenevolent. Number 4. Consider the fact that God does allow people with no free will or partial free will, for example, people in coma, paralysis, and people with mental disabilities, say autism, insanity, schizophrenia, and other mental disorders, to exist in our world. He creates people who are paralyzed, who cannot move, and so on. This means free will, if it existed, lies on a spectrum. If partial free will is possible, God can create humans who are limited such that they could only perform good acts and prevent evil from existing in the first place, or even reduce the number of evil acts possible. But that's not the world we are living in. He allows for the freedom to kill, rape, and torture. Number 5. Since God has knowledge of counterfactuals, that is, what would happen under different circumstances, he knows what P will do even if God does not cause P to perform an action A in a circumstance C. So in weakly actualized worlds, God does know what his creations will do even if God is not the cause. So it is possible for God to actualize some better free circumstances over others. God in this case can eliminate C in every case where P would perform a wrong action A. When God avoids having his subjects caught in situations and events that allow the wrong action, he is not eliminating free will. He is at most affecting what options are open for the subjects, while they still can choose one action over the other. Number 6. I don't think that a world with human beings with free will but immense amount of evil is the best possible world. I think a world with the least amount of suffering and more happiness is better than our world, even if it means that we have to compromise with free will. Freedom is overrated. Number 7. But I agree that if freedom is added to the world, it will be a more valuable world. But goodness existed even before human beings existed, for example, in animals. But since human beings are the only creatures that God would apparently attribute free will to, it means that goodness exists even before free will exists. So it is possible to have good worlds even if you don't have free will. And God could have easily created such a world, but with lot less evil, or no evil at all. God could have prevented people who would go on to commit wrong actions from existing and create only free will people who would commit good deeds. Is this really the best possible world that God could create? The free will evil is called moral evil, like murders, rape, violence, thefts, dishonesty, lying, cheating, etc. But we have all other kinds of evil, like natural evil, disasters, avalanches, blizzards, ice storms, wildfires, heat waves, droughts, tornadoes, tsunamis, thunderstorms, cyclones, floods, landslides, earthquakes, and so on. How would God explain that He is all good by allowing all this to happen unnecessarily, gratuitous evil, if He is under control of everything? I am extremely thankful to Stephen Law for this point. Stephen is the Director of Philosophy at the Department of Continuing Education, University of Oxford. He is an expert on the problem of evil and is famous for his evil God hypothesis. I'll try bringing you on in this channel someday, hopefully. He suggested me that Plantinga's free will defense is only a defense against the logical problem of evil, an unsuccessful attempt at that. But what Plantinga can never get around is the evidential problem of evil, the amount of evil that is evident and unnecessary in this world that we can see.
It is gratuitous evil, pointless evil. Philosopher William Rowe had a nice example. In some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. As far as we can see, the fawn's suffering is pointless, and this sort of suffering could have been easily prevented by an omnipotent, omniscient, holy, good God. Even if you could come up with a reason, some kind of crazy reason like across the world some greater good or prevention of greater evil is going to happen, and it could only happen if for some reason that fawn suffered in that particular way, we must then ask, is it reasonable to believe this? Couldn't an omnipotent God have created a world in which that fawn had to suffer even a second, or a minute, or an hour, or even a day lesser of suffering? Why exactly that amount of suffering, and why not any less? There is no point to that suffering. The fawn just burns and dies, stuck under the tree. Nobody's aware or sees that the fawn is suffering. It just experiences excruciating pain until it dies in a few days. What overall good does that even produce? These events don't serve a point, or at least a point that is proportional to the harm that it produces. We can imagine many such examples, including a baby being beaten, raped, and strangled to death. That has happened or does happen in our world. That and others that would be really horrible to imagine.
So sentience, sensation of pain and suffering, and even pleasure, happiness, negative and positive experiences, is something that us living beings have evolved around 530 to 540 million years ago via the process of mutation and natural selection during the Cambrian explosion. There have been quintillions and quintillions of individual non-free-willed sentient beings who have gone through septillions and septillions of hours of pain and suffering and misery, and who still are, including the suffering that we are inflicting on them in factory farms. I hope you see where I'm going with this. If the problem of evil is solved by free will, then how could we explain all this unnecessary suffering? Disabilities, disasters, diseases, unfulfilled desires, non-free-willed evil or natural evil, lack of resources, starvation, famines, wars, violence, accidents, and so on. Evolution thrives on and requires suffering in the process of survival of the fittest. It requires that those who aren't the fittest have to suffer, and the least fit would have to undergo ridiculous amount of suffering. Even the fittest have to suffer. 99.9% species on Earth have gone extinct. Imagine, 99.9% species. And there are more yet to go extinct. There hasn't been a sentient living being who hasn't suffered, but there have been sentient living beings who have not experienced pleasure at all. This happens even in ourselves, what we call the most advanced species on Earth, Homo sapiens. Evolutionary pressure and competition, evolutionary psychology leading to stuff like fights and wars over nationalism, tribalism, regionism, religionism, casteism, bigotry, and so on. Women cheating men for money, wealth, and pride. Men falling for looks and allowing suffering in women as well as men by cheating them or stealing others as women or property. All these stuff have evolutionary underpinning. Do you still think that this is the best possible world that we could live in? No. If you were God, you would have created a better world in which there is lesser amount of suffering or no suffering at all. But that isn't the world that we are living in, which makes a mockery of God's omnibenevolence. Number 10. If all living creatures were incapable of pain and suffering, then evil would never have found a place in our universe. But that's not God's best possible world. It's apparently this one in which all kinds of evil exists and pain and suffering exists. If creating free-willed beings is the best thing or an extremely valuable thing for God, then why doesn't He create more and more freely willed beings into existence if He's omnipotent? There are zillions of uncreated people for every person that is born. If leaving a person uncreated violates his or her free will, then God is already massively guilty of denying free will to zillions of uncreated people. The objection thus undermines the assumption that free will is the most important thing for God, which is the point of the whole argument in the first place. Number 12. Plantinga says nothing about causality, determinism, cause and effect, indeterminism, psychological determinism, nothing about all that. He just asserts that there is some kind of magical free will. If freedom of the will is so important for God, He could have created a world in which human beings are so free will is so powerful than we have right now, that we could cure diseases in the wink of an eye. We could eliminate disasters and disabilities in a whip. We could avoid all accidents by our thoughts. We could resurrect dead people. We could easily roam around the universe as much as we want, whenever we want, wherever we want. If free will is the most valuable thing, that would be the world we live in. But that's clearly not the world we live in. So free will probably isn't really that valuable for God, or it is valuable, but only in the exact amount that is present or given to us. Any more or less free will would be undesirable for God. So wouldn't that mean, for example, that we shouldn't be locking criminals and murderers up in jail because it reduces their free will, and that we shouldn't care about science and technology because it improves our freedom? Number 14. Only an imperfect, inferior God has to plan ahead what kind of a world He wants to create from among different possible worlds in actualizing a world. A perfect God who commits errors and who guards against errors? No, a perfect God doesn't commit errors. Whatever He does is correct, it's perfect. So there is no reason to plan ahead what kind of world He wants to create, because He is innately perfect. A God who chooses between different alternatives and who has to gamble and take risks is not a perfect God, and is not the God of classical theism. Can consciously imposed evil and suffering exist in heaven? If yes, then it's not heaven. If no, then your free will is restricted. Would you consider it heaven if you're kind of a robot who is programmed to only be able to do good deeds with no freedom? No. But if you think about it, you have free will in hell. Now, you'd say that it is possible that you can't commit evil in heaven, but free will exists in heaven. This just defeats the whole point of Plantinga's argument, which says that there can't be a place where there is free will but no evil. Now, one could say that free will beings suffer from transworld depravity, but then free will beings in heaven too suffer from transworld depravity. Now, one could insist that God intends that heaven does not have transworld depravity. But now you'll have to admit that God not only allows suffering and evil to happen in the natural world, but in fact causes it to exist, and we are back to questioning His omnibenevolence. Now let's go back to the problem of divine foreknowledge. Plantinga believes that God is omniscient, but when asked about free will, here's what he has to say.
He just sees what's the case. Well, then he said, whatever God sees to be the case is necessarily the case. There's got to be something wrong with this argument.
Not really, Alvin. There is nothing wrong with the argument. It's just your personal incredulity. So, inspired by Thomas Aquinas and derived from his own argument for the existence of God, called the modal ontological argument, which I will debunk sometime in the future, hopefully. This is what Plantinga has to say.
Standing is necessarily standing. Whatever's seen by God to be standing is necessarily standing. The way to put that would be to say everybody is such that every possible world in which he is seen to be standing is a world in which he is standing. But of course, from that, it doesn't follow that I'm necessarily standing in the sense that I'm standing in every possible world at that time. All it follows is I'm standing in the actual world at that time.
You don't have to be standing in every possible world to be necessarily standing, because God has actualized the world and every event in that world will only turn out one way. Now, even if you assume Plantinga's possible worlds, for a decision to be made in the future in the actual world, it only has to be necessarily made in the actual world, not all possible worlds. You just have to be standing in the actual world to be necessarily standing, because God necessarily knows what is going to happen in the future in the actual world. So the decision you're going to take is necessary in the actual world.
Standing in the sense that I'm standing in every possible world at that time. All it follows is I'm standing in the actual world at that time. So the argument really confuses what's true in the actual world with what's true in every possible world.
But Al, if God is all-knowing, He not only knows what's going to happen in possible worlds, He also knows what's going to happen in the actual world. Remember, Plantinga himself said that God actualizes a world from among different possible worlds. So when He actualizes the actual world from different possible worlds, He necessarily knows what's going to happen in the actual world in the future.
There's no possible world in which He has a false belief, but there are possible worlds in which He believes something different from what He believes in fact in the actual world.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, right.
But His beliefs about the actual world that He actuates from different possible worlds are true, and whatever happens in the actual world in the future necessarily follows from His divine foreknowledge. So, Plantinga out of the way, let's get to